So until now, we talked about the Ricardo model and the Heckscher-Ohlin approach, and these two models belong to the so-called Neoclassical trade theory. An important assumption of this model class is that two countries trade with each other because they are different. We talk about the so-called North-South trade. North-South, two countries trade with each other which are different. In the Ricardo world, it was a case that the production function was different because the stand of knowledge was different. In the Heckscher-Ohlin world, the stand of knowledge was the same, but the factor endowment was different. So the capital-labor ratio was different in Germany compared to China. The Krugman model belongs to the so-called new trade theory. Krugman, he wants to explain the so-called North-North trade, so trade between countries which don't look different. Trade which takes place between like two industrialized countries, like trade between Germany and France or trade between the US and Japan. I invited Paul Krugman to give a short talk, but he said thank you very much for the invitation. He was not able to come, but he sent us a short link to a video where he explains the new trade theory, which is a very interesting interview. So let's have a look at this interview.
Paul Krugman is here. He is a Princeton professor, a New York Times columnist, and this year's Nobel Prize recipient in economics. He gets a prestigious award for his study of international trade and the effects of globalization. It is a great time to welcome Paul Krugman back to this table. Welcome.
Hi there.
And what was it that so impressed the Nobel Committee that they decided to give you the economics prize, which is a big one?
Well, I think, economists have talked about international trade for, a couple of centuries. Right. And for about 180 of those 200 years, there was a basic view, which was that countries trade because they're different. This country's tropical, so it exports bananas. This country's got lots of land, so it exports wheat. And there was this kind of building discontent because a lot of world trade is between countries that don't look very different. And it's very difficult to come up with some fundamental reason why the United States should be making jet aircraft and not some European country, and why the Japanese should be ahead of us in the car industry, or they used to be, and not in something else. And there were some stories about it, but it hadn't really been pulled together. And I and a few other people put together this thing, the new trade theory, which talked about how very small, almost accidental advantages get built into larger advantages that then persist over time. So it can be almost some story. We have our favorite story. All the carpet production in the United States used to be located around Dalton, Georgia.
Yeah, right.
And where does that come from? And it actually traces back to some teenage girl who made a tufted bedspread as a wedding gift in 1895, and then one thing led to another. And so that kind of thing. And this built into a theory of international trade. And it was really important to have the nice little mathematical models, because that's how you clarify your thoughts. And then after that, you can start to talk in plain English. And also then the location of production within countries. That was the sort of the second string to this. And it was, a lot of it sounds obvious now, but it was completely new. Nobody could think about these things clearly until that worked.
That reminds me, the furniture business is in High Point, North Carolina. Yeah. It's sort of a center of the global furniture business in part.
Yeah, a bunch of costume jewelry.
I have no idea why it's true.
Costume jewelry is in and near Providence, and that's because some guy invented filled gold in the 1790s. No, there are all these stories, and there was a great story about the detachable collar and cuff industry of Troy, New York, which unfortunately is no longer with us.
Great. So, you got a first impression what new trade theory is all about. So Paul Krugman, he highlighted that most of the international trade which took place when he was looking out of his window of the university was between countries which look the same. So a lot of trade was going on between countries which are similar. So international trade was dominated by North-North trade. And North-North trade cannot be explained by the neoclassical trade theory. North-North trade cannot be explained by Ricardo model or the Heckscher-Ohlin model because of the fact that both approaches assume that the two countries are different. To some extent, very bad. So we invested about 1 hour to learn about Ricardo and Heckscher-Ohlin, and it doesn't seem to be relevant. This is the impression of the first part of the Krugman video. But let's have a look at the second part of the interview and let's check whether this impression changes with the second part.
Are trading patterns changing significantly now because of the obvious reasons? I mean, China's building up a manufacturing base and it can manufacture things that the rest of the world has wanted and could sell them at an effective price.
Yeah, there's actually a funny story about that because I was doing a lot of this work in the sort of 1980 or so when the world trade has kind of shifted from the sort of north-south.
Right.
European countries trading with their colonies to north-north trade, all of these advanced countries trading with each other. And no sooner did we have this new theory about why there was so much north-north trade that north-south trade started growing again. And now we have this big shift. In some ways, the old trade theory is more relevant now than it was when I was writing. So, the latest wrinkle in theory is not necessarily the latest thing in the world.
But is the most dramatic change taking place because of these emerging markets that have both economic power as well, and in terms of demand and...
Oh yeah, it's transformational. I mean, when I was in grad school, the developing countries didn't count economically. They were just too small. If you knew what was happening in the G7, you knew what was happening in the world economy.
Right.
Now we're in a world economy where, China isn't yet the world's biggest economy, but it will be. And we've just had a big shift of the center of gravity towards these new powers.
Great. So in the second part of the interview, Krugman says, the old trade theory is more relevant today than it was when I was developing the new trade theory. So when Krugman was sitting down in the university and thinking about trade was dominated by North-North trade, and he wanted to explain this North-North trading pattern. But when he was done with it, when he invented the new trade theory, it was a case that the trading patterns have shifted again from North-North trade to North-South trade, because now the US is trading with China again. So therefore, I think that the neoclassical trade theory today is once more very important to explain the relationship between the US and China. But nevertheless, let's have a look at Paul Krugman's new trade theory and the assumptions behind this approach. So, in the first step, let's clarify two terms: intra-industry trade. So here, a country's exports and imports are in different production classification categories. This can be explained by the Ricardo or the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Then we talk about North-South trade. For example, we are trading cars against bananas. So this trade occurs in different product classification categories. And then intra-industry trade, this occurs when a country is both exporting and importing in the same product classification categories. Then we talk about North-North trade. So for example, we could think about that Germany is producing a Volkswagen, a VW, and in France it is the case that a Peugeot is produced, and now France is exporting Peugeots and France is importing Volkswagen. So we have North-North trade. Two industrialized countries are trading with each other, and trade occurs in the same product classification category. Like Krugman's model can explain North-North trade, And although the countries are completely the same in the autarky scenario, they have an incentive to trade. Let's have a look at one very, very simple element of the new trade theory. We once more assume that labor is the only factor of production, and we are producing with economies of scale. We are producing with the following input-output relationship. So the number of labor we need is equal to B plus A times Q. L is the amount of labor needed by the firm, B is a constant, and A specifies the relation between the output level Q and the amount of labor needed. Due to the fact that B is larger than 0, doubling of output requires less than doubling of input. So the economy is producing with so-called economies of scale. This equation is different from the Ricardo world, where we have constant returns to scale, whereas this variable B did not play a role. Like in the Ricardo world, we had the input-output relationship given by equation 1 prime, L is equal to A times Q. Let's directly come up with a numerical example. Let's assume that B is equal to 5 and A is equal to 1, so that equation 1 becomes equation 1 prime, L is equal to 5 plus Q. What kind of industry are we talking about? We are talking about the university. A is equal to 1. What does it imply? One professor can give one lecture. A is equal to 1. In case that you want to have 2 lectures, you need 2 professors. Or in case that you want to, or in case that you have 5 professors, they can give 5 lectures. What does it B is equal to 5 imply? At a university, we also have a president, we have a chancellor, we have a dean in the economics faculty, a dean in the law faculty, and a dean in the faculty for social sciences. Those 5 people, they don't give a lecture. They are just sitting around, but they are also there in this company. They receive a wage rate, but they are not producing lectures. Therefore, for example, when you want to have an output of 5 lectures, you need 10 units of labor. 5 people which are sitting around and 5 people who are producing these 5 lectures. In case that you want to produce 10 lectures, you need 15 people. 5 which are sitting around and 10 who are giving lectures. With total labor input of 25, it is the case that you can produce 20 output units, 20 lectures. 5 people are just sitting around and 20 people are giving 20 lectures. So I think that now this relationship really makes sense. As you can see in the last column of the table, the average labor input decreases with the size of output. So in case that output converges to infinity, it would be the case that average labor input would converge to 1. And this just implies that the company, the university, is producing with economies of scale. A larger university has a better cost structure. Let's assume that in the autarky scenario, we have 2 industries. We have a university which is producing lectures, and we have an automotive sector which is producing cars. Let's also assume that overall we have 30 units of labor in the US and 30 units of labor in the UK. Once more, the US and the UK they split labor 50-50, so that 15 labor units are used in the American educational sector and 15 labor units are used in the automotive sector of the US. What about the output in case that we have 15 units of labor in the American car industry? When we have 15 units of labor in the American car industry, output will be equal to 10 cars. 5 people are just sitting around, 10 people are producing the cars, so the car output is equal to 10. What about the university sector, the educational sector in the US? Also here we have 15 labor units in the US. Educational sector, 5 people are sitting around, 10 professors are producing 10 lectures. So we can fill in this table here. In the US, we have 10 lectures and 10 cars. And we assume that the same situation prevails in the UK. The UK is completely identical to the US in the autarky scenario, so that also 10 lectures can be produced in the UK and 10 cars can be produced in the UK. So that world output is equal to 20 lectures and 20 cars. Let's now assume that we concentrate labor input in one country, in the US, in one sector. Let's assume that the 30 labor units in the US are all occupied in the American educational system. So with 30 labor units in the American universities, number of lectures can be equal to 25. Since no one is working in the American automotive industry, output in the US will be equal to 0 cars. So, when it comes to international trade, in a first step, the companies are specializing. The automotive car industry shrinks completely to 0. Therefore, 30 units of labor can be applied in the American educational sector, and the output is 25. The opposite occurs in the UK. The UK is completely focusing on the car industry, and with 30 people in the car industry, 25 cars can be manufactured. The UK abolishes the educational system completely, so the numbers of lectures are equal to 0. The world output now is equal to 25 lectures and 25 cars. And you can see here, when you compare the production quantities with specialization with the production quantities in autarky, that world output is up in both sectors. Now it is just a question of how these additional units are split up. Let's assume once more that the terms of trade are equal to 1-to-1. We are trading 1 lecture for 1 car, and the US is exporting 12.5 lectures, and the UK is exporting 12.5 cars. So that in the end, the US can consume 12.5 lectures and 12.5 cars. The UK can consume 12.5 lectures and 12.5 cars. So the world production of 25 lectures and 25 cars is split 50-50 among the two countries. And now it really becomes clear that when you compare the consumption possibilities in autarky with the consumption possibilities with specialization and free trade, it is a case that consumption is up in both sectors in both countries. Hence, we have proven here that international trade is also beneficial when two countries trade with each other which are looking the same. So we are able to explain here why North-North trade is beneficial. It's due to the fact that here the two sectors will increase in size. When the two sectors increase in size, they have a better cost structure, and hence both economies will benefit from these economies of scale, and larger companies have a better cost structure. This gives the opportunity to increase output. Once more, one could ask the question, where does America get the labor from, and what happens to the labor that was employed in this industry? America reduced labor input in another industry, so the US was focusing on the educational sector and was specializing in education, so that the labor input in car industry was abolished completely, and the US will import these kind of cars from the UK. The UK will expand in the car industry. Both countries can take advantage of economies of scale, and each country has to concentrate on producing only a limited number of industries. So each country can only produce in a limited number of industries. So, for example, America might concentrate on industries 1, 3, and 5, and the UK might concentrate on the industries 2, 4, and 6. Afterwards, the two countries could trade with each other, and this would lead to an increase in the consumption possibilities. It is not specified here whether America will take over the car industry or the plane industry or whatever. This does not matter, because in autarky the two countries are the same, and thereby it's not determined whether the one or the other country will take over the one or the other industry. What is very important is that in this smaller theoretical approach, we have a complete specialization, because only when we have a complete specialization, the two economies are able to reduce the number of people which are sitting around and doing nothing. Only when there is a complete specialization, the two countries benefit from international trade.